Hollywood and fans from all over are mourning the loss of legendary actor Ray Liotta. Native Newarker died in his sleep in the Dominican Republic where he was shooting a movie.
Ray Liotta walked into his hotel room after a long day of filming. He was thousands of miles from home, surrounded by cast and crew who had no idea that this would be the last night of his life. He lay down, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. For nearly a year, nobody knew exactly what killed him. The autopsy report revealed the truth behind his death, which is more haunting than any movie he ever made. The night the world lost a legend. On a quiet night in late May 2022, something happened in the Dominican Republic that would send shockwaves across the entire entertainment world. Ray Liotta, one of the most recognizable and unforgettable actors of his generation, passed away at the age of 67. He died in his sleep while on location filming the action thriller Dangerous Waters. His publicist confirmed the news, and within hours, the story was everywhere. What made this death so deeply unsettling was not the fact that it happened. People pass away every day. What shook everyone to their core was how normal everything had been leading up to it. There were no warning signs. There was no dramatic collapse on set. There was no emergency call in the middle of the night. Ray Liotta simply went to sleep after what appeared to be a perfectly ordinary day of work, and he never woke up. At the time of his passing, Liotta was not a man winding down. He was not retired. He was not sitting at home waiting for the phone to ring. He was actively working, fully committed to his craft, and deeply engaged in multiple projects. He was engaged to his partner JC Nitolo, a woman he adored and spoke about with genuine warmth in interviews. He was a proud father to his daughter Carson, who had followed him into acting and appeared alongside him in several projects. Life, by every visible measure, was good. Tributes flooded social media within hours. Co-stars, directors, writers, and millions of fans shared their memories and shock. Many spoke about his explosive energy on screen and his generous, down-to-earth nature off camera. Robert De Niro called him a great actor. Lorraine Bracco, who played his wife in Goodfellas, said she was utterly shattered by the news. Alessandro Nivola, who was working with him on the set of Dangerous Waters at the time, described the loss as devastating and sudden. Martin Scorsese, the director who gave him his most iconic role, praised his extraordinary talent and the fearless commitment he brought to every scene. Seth Rogen shared that Liotta was one of the kindest people he had ever worked with in the industry. But behind all the tributes and headlines, a question lingered that nobody could answer right away. What actually happened? How does a man who appeared healthy, active, and full of life simply stop breathing in his sleep? The answer would take nearly a full year to arrive, and when it did, it would peel back layers that nobody expected. Because the truth about Ray Liotta's death was not simple. It was not dramatic. It was something far more unsettling. It was silent, invisible, and it had been building inside him for years without anyone knowing. The autopsy that changed everything. For almost a year after his death, the world waited for answers. Speculation ran wild on social media and in tabloids. Some suggested foul play. Others assumed illegal substances or alcohol. A few even floated conspiracy theories. But when the official autopsy report was finally released by authorities in the Dominican Republic, the truth was both less dramatic and far more chilling than anyone had imagined. The report stated that Ray Liotta died of natural causes. There was no violence, no substances, and no external factors involved. The specific medical findings pointed to pulmonary edema, which means fluid had accumulated in his lungs. This was accompanied by heart failure and respiratory failure. Together, these conditions created a chain reaction that quietly shut his body down while he slept. But the most revealing detail buried in the autopsy was the underlying condition responsible for all of it: atherosclerotic disease. This is a condition where fats, cholesterol, and other substances gradually build up inside the walls of the arteries over time. The buildup narrows the arteries and restricts blood flow, putting increasing strain on the heart. It is one of the most common causes of heart disease in the world. And it is also one of the most dangerous because it can develop for decades without causing a single noticeable symptom. Dominican court documents indicated that Liotta likely died somewhere between 8 and 10 hours before his body was discovered, which strongly suggests he passed peacefully in his sleep rather than experiencing any acute distress or pain. There was no struggle. There was no call for help. His heart simply could not keep up with the damage that had been quietly accumulating inside his body for years. For fans and loved ones, this information was both a relief and a source of profound sadness. Relief because it confirmed he did not suffer. Sadness because it meant his death could have potentially been prevented if the condition had been caught earlier. Atherosclerosis is treatable when detected. Lifestyle changes, medication, and medical intervention can slow or even reverse its progression. But the cruel nature of this disease is that it often gives no warning until it is too late. This revelation reframed everything people thought they knew about Liotta's final months. His death was not a sudden event. It was the quiet conclusion of a long, invisible decline that had been happening inside his body while he continued to live, work, and love as though everything was perfectly fine. Doctors and medical experts who commented on the findings noted that cases like Liotta's are tragically common. Millions of people around the world are walking around right now with the same condition silently developing inside their arteries, completely unaware that their bodies are slowly running out of time. For someone like Liotta, who appeared fit, active, and full of energy, the idea that his cardiovascular system was failing seemed almost impossible to believe. But that is exactly what makes atherosclerosis so terrifying. It does not care how famous you are, how busy your schedule is, or how much life you have left to live. And yet, as shocking as the medical findings were, they only told half the story. Because to truly understand who Ray Liotta was and why his loss hit so hard, you have to go back to the very beginning. You have to go back to a baby lying in an orphanage in New Jersey, alone and unnamed, waiting for someone to claim him. The boy nobody wanted. Ray Liotta was born on December 18, 1954, in Newark, New Jersey. But unlike most children, he did not go home with his biological parents. He was abandoned as an infant and placed in an orphanage, where he waited for 6 months before a couple named Mary and Alfred Liotta decided to adopt him. Mary was Italian-American. Alfred was Scottish-American. They lived in Union, New Jersey, and they gave Ray their last name and a stable, loving home. They also adopted a daughter named Linda, who became Ray's sister. Ray always knew he was adopted. His parents never hid it from him. In fact, he was so comfortable with the information that he once brought it up during a kindergarten show and tell. He stood in front of his classmates and casually told them he was adopted, as though it were just another interesting fact about himself. But beneath that casual exterior, there were deep and complicated feelings that took decades to fully surface. Growing up, Ray often found himself wondering about his biological parents. Who were they? Why did they give him up? Was there something wrong with him that made them not want him? These questions did not dominate his daily life, but they were always there, simmering just below the surface. In interviews later in life, he spoke about how being adopted shaped his identity in ways that were hard to explain. He described carrying a sense of being different, of not quite belonging, even when surrounded by people who loved him. His adoptive father, Alfred, owned an auto parts store, and the family lived a modest, working-class life. They were not wealthy, and they had no connections to the entertainment industry. There was nothing about Ray's upbringing that pointed toward a future in Hollywood. But there was something burning inside him, an intensity and an emotional depth that set him apart from the kids around him. That inner fire, fueled in part by the unresolved questions of his origins, would eventually become the very thing that made him one of the most compelling actors of his generation. Sits somewhere deep inside, not always sits somewhere deep inside, not always visible, not always active, but always present. For Ray, this manifested as a kind of emotional restlessness, a need to prove himself, a desire to connect deeply with others, and a lingering fear that the connections he formed might not be permanent. These were feelings he carried his entire life, and they became the invisible fuel that powered some of the most intense and memorable performances in film history. Built a career, started a family, and became famous. And then, well into adulthood, he decided to do something that many adoptees think about, but very few actually go through with. He decided to find his birth mother. What he discovered when he finally tracked her down did not just answer his questions. It completely reshaped the way he understood himself, his family, and every relationship he had ever had. The reunion that changed his heart. Sometime in his 40s, around the early 2000s, Ray Liotta made the decision that would alter the course of his emotional life forever. He hired a private detective to track down his biological mother. Part of the motivation came from his daughter Carson, who was growing up and naturally curious about her father's roots. Part of it came from Ray himself, from a place deep inside that had never stopped asking the question that had followed him since childhood. Why was I given away? The detective found her, and not just her. Ray discovered that he had an entire biological family he had never known about. He had one full sister who shared both biological parents. He had one half-brother, and he had 5 half-sisters. An entire world of blood relatives had been living their lives just beyond the edges of his awareness for his entire existence. The reunion was deeply emotional. When Ray finally met his biological mother, he learned the truth about why she had given him up. She had felt unable to provide a stable life for him at the time of his birth. It was not that she did not want him. It was that she believed giving him to someone who could take better care of him was the most loving thing she could do. For Ray, hearing this directly from her was like having a wound that had been open for 40 years finally begin to close. In interviews after the reunion, Liotta spoke about how profoundly the experience changed his perspective. He said that for years he had carried a quiet sense of rejection, a feeling that he had been unwanted. But meeting his birth mother flipped that narrative entirely. He began to see his adoption not as an act of abandonment, but as an act of protection. His biological mother gave him away so he could have a better life. And his adoptive parents, Mary and Alfred, gave him exactly that. Ray also spoke with deep gratitude about his adoptive parents in the years following the reunion. He said he realized more than ever how lucky he was to have been raised by people who loved him unconditionally and who gave him every opportunity they could. He described his adoption as a gift, not a wound. That shift in perspective was one of the most important transformations of his entire life. But finding peace with his past did not erase the complexity of who he was. If anything, it added new layers. Because now Ray Liotta was not just a man who had been given up as a baby. He was a man who had found his origins, made peace with them, and carried that emotional richness into everything he did. And nowhere was that richness more visible than in his work. Because the roles Ray Liotta chose were never random, they were deeply personal. And the performances he gave came from a place that most actors can only pretend to understand. The roles that came from real pain. Ray Liotta did not grow up dreaming of being an actor. There was no childhood fantasy about walking red carpets or starring in movies. He attended the University of Miami, originally without any clear plan for his future. But then, something happened that changed the entire direction of his life. He wandered into a drama class on a whim, auditioned for a part, and felt something click inside him that he had never felt before. Acting gave him a way to channel the intensity and emotion that had been building inside him for years. He graduated with a Bachelor of Fine Arts and quickly landed his first professional role on the soap opera Another World in 1978. He worked on that show for several years, learning his craft and building a foundation for what was to come. But the big time was still a long way off. His breakout moment came in 1986 with the film Something Wild, directed by Jonathan Demme. Liotta played a volatile, dangerous man who disrupts the lives of the two main characters, and his performance was so electrifying that it earned him a Golden Globe nomination. Hollywood suddenly took notice. This was not just another handsome face. This was a man who could make you feel genuinely uncomfortable, genuinely afraid, and genuinely fascinated all at the same time. 3 years later, he played Shoeless Joe Jackson in Field of Dreams, alongside Kevin Costner. The role was the complete opposite of his work in Something Wild. It was gentle, nostalgic, and deeply moving. Audiences who had been terrified of him just a few years earlier now found themselves in tears watching him play a ghost who gets one more chance to play baseball. The range was extraordinary. But the role that would define his legacy forever came in 1990. Martin Scorsese cast him as Henry Hill in Goodfellas, a sweeping epic about the rise and fall of a real-life mobster. Liotta delivered a performance that many critics still consider one of the greatest in the history of cinema. He brought Henry Hill to life with a combination of charm, menace, vulnerability, and desperation that felt impossibly real. You rooted for him. You feared him. You pitied him. Sometimes all in the same scene. What few people realized at the time was how much of himself Liotta poured into that role. Henry Hill was a man caught between two worlds, never fully belonging to either one. He was a man who craved acceptance and love, but kept making choices that pushed people away. For Liotta, who had spent his entire life navigating questions of identity, belonging, and self-worth, the parallels were impossible to ignore. Interestingly, Liotta once revealed in an interview that despite playing some of the most intimidating and violent characters in film history, he had never been in a real fight in his entire life. Not once. The man who terrified audiences around the world was, in his private life, gentle, thoughtful, and surprisingly soft-spoken. That contrast between who he was on screen and who he was off-screen became one of the most fascinating things about him. He also had his share of regrets. He turned down the role of Harvey Dent in Tim Burton's Batman, a decision he later admitted he wished he could take back. There were other opportunities that slipped away, other paths not taken. But through it all, he kept working. He kept showing up, and he kept delivering performances that reminded everyone why they had fallen in love with him in the first place. But while his career was a journey of incredible highs and quiet frustrations, his personal life was its own epic story, full of love found, love lost, and love found again. Love, heartbreak, and the people who mattered most. In 1991, Ray Liotta experienced one of the most devastating losses of his life. His adoptive mother, Mary, the woman who had taken him out of that orphanage and given him a home and a name, passed away from breast cancer. For Ray, who had always been deeply connected to his adoptive parents, the loss was enormous. He described it as a turning point in his emotional life, a moment that forced him to confront the fragility of the relationships he had always taken for granted. 6 years later, in 1997, he married actress Michelle Grace. The following year, in 1998, their daughter Carson was born. Carson would grow up to become the most important person in Ray's life. She inherited his passion for performing and eventually began acting herself, appearing alongside her father in several projects. The bond between them was visible to anyone who saw them together. He was fiercely protective of her, enormously proud of her, and deeply devoted to being the best father he could be. Ray carried the weight of that failure with him. He spoke in interviews about the difficulty of balancing the demands of his career with the needs of his personal relationships. The long hours on set, the emotional toll of inhabiting dark characters, and the constant travel all took their toll on his ability to be present for the people who mattered most. But life had one more chapter of love in store for him. He met JC Nitolo, and the connection between them was immediate and powerful. In late 2020, they became engaged, and the period that followed was widely described by those close to him as one of the happiest of his entire life. He spoke about JC with a warmth and openness that surprised even people who had known him for years. It was as though, after decades of emotional searching, he had finally found the peace and stability he had always craved. Ray also spoke candidly about the emotional toll his career had taken on him over the years. Certain roles had left deep marks. Playing dark, violent, and emotionally unstable characters required him to access parts of himself that he would have preferred to leave undisturbed. He described the process as draining and sometimes frightening, but also as necessary. For Liotta, acting was never just a job. It was a form of emotional excavation, a way of digging into the deepest parts of himself and bringing what he found to the surface for the whole world to see. Through all of it, through the marriages and the divorces, the triumphs and the setbacks, the joy and the grief, one thing remained constant. Ray Liotta was a man of extraordinary emotional depth. He felt things deeply, loved fiercely, and carried the weight of his experiences with a quiet grace that most people never saw. And when he finally left this world, the legacy he left behind was not just a collection of unforgettable films. It was something far more personal and far more enduring. The legacy that refuses to fade. In February 2023, less than a year after his death, Ray Liotta was posthumously honored with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. His daughter, Carson, accepted the honor on his behalf, standing in front of cameras with tears in her eyes and a strength that would have made her father proud. It was a moment that captured everything beautiful and heartbreaking about his story. The boy who was abandoned in an orphanage now had his name permanently etched into the most famous sidewalk in the world. The ceremony drew a crowd of fans, many of whom had traveled from across the country just to be there. Some held signs, some held flowers, and some simply stood in silence, paying their respects to a man who had touched their lives through a screen, but felt as real and present as anyone they had ever known. But Liotta's legacy extends far beyond a star on a sidewalk. His filmography spans decades and includes some of the most iconic roles in cinema history. Goodfellas remains a cultural touchstone, regularly appearing on lists of the greatest films ever made. Field of Dreams continues to move audiences to tears more than 30 years after its release. And his later work, including roles in Marriage Story, The Many Saints of Newark, and the dark comedy, proved that his talent and commitment to his craft never diminished with age. One of the most striking things about Liotta's career is the range he displayed throughout it. He could play a terrifying gangster and a gentle ghost. He could be menacing and vulnerable in the same breath. He could make you laugh in one scene and make your blood run cold in the next. That kind of range does not come from technique alone. It comes from lived experience, from emotional depth, from a life that has been shaped by both pain and love in equal measure. And that is perhaps the most important thing to understand about Ray Liotta. His greatness as an actor was not separate from his struggles as a human being. It was a direct product of them. The boy who grew up wondering why he was given away became a man who could portray the full spectrum of human emotion with a rawness and honesty that few actors have ever matched. His pain became his power. His questions became his depth. And his journey from orphanage to Hollywood legend became one of the most compelling real-life stories in the history of the entertainment industry. His co-stars and collaborators have spoken at length about what it was like to work with him. They describe a man who was generous with his time and energy, who lifted the performances of everyone around him, and who approached every role with the seriousness and dedication of someone who understood that acting was not just entertainment. It was truth-telling. It was a way of holding up a mirror to the human experience and saying, "Look at this, feel this, understand this." And he did the same thing with his own. And he did the same thing with his own life. He was open about his adoption, about his search for his birth family, about his struggles and his joys. He never pretended to be someone he was not. In a town built on illusion, he was relentlessly, unapologetically real. What makes Liotta's P.E.P.'s story truly unique in Hollywood is the way his personal journey mirrored the themes of his greatest work. Think about Henry Hill in Goodfellas. Here was a man who desperately wanted to belong, who craved acceptance from a world that was never truly his, and who ultimately had to reckon with the consequences of the life he had built. Now think about Ray Liotta himself, a boy abandoned at birth, raised by people who chose to love him, spending decades searching for the biological family he never knew, and ultimately finding peace not in answers, but in acceptance. The parallels are almost too perfect to be coincidental. There is a scene in Goodfellas where Henry Hill sits in a courtroom, about to enter witness protection, and you can see in his eyes the weight of everything he has lost, and everything he will never get back. That look was not just acting. That was Ray Liotta channeling every moment of uncertainty, every question left unanswered, every relationship tested by the demands of a life lived at full intensity. It was real, and audiences could feel it, even if they could not name what they were feeling. In his final years, Liotta took on roles that showed a new side of his talent. In Marriage Story, he played a sharp, confident divorce lawyer, bringing humor and edge to what could have been a one-note part. In The Many Saints of Newark, the Sopranos prequel, he played two different characters, demonstrating a versatility that left critics and audiences genuinely amazed. Released after his death, he showed that he could bring gravitas and charm even to the most absurd and outlandish material. Every single project he took on received the full force of his commitment. and every performance reminded the world why he had been irreplaceable for over 4 decades. Perhaps the greatest testament to Ray Liotta's legacy is the way other actors and filmmakers talk about him. They do not just praise his talent, they praise his humanity. They talk about the way he would stay on set long after his scenes were finished to help younger actors with their performances. They talk about the way he would offer quiet encouragement to crew members who were having a tough day. They talk about a man who understood that making great art was not just about individual brilliance, but about lifting everyone around you to a higher level. Of himself and everyone around him, and of himself and everyone around him, and the extraordinary story of his life continue to resonate. They continue to inspire. They continue to remind us that the most powerful performances do not come from pretending. They come from living. That was the story of Ray Liotta, a man whose real life was more extraordinary than any role he ever played. What moment from his life or career hit you the hardest? Drop your thoughts in the comments below.